All right. Now, today we're going to talk about the early church from the period starting around AD 100, right about the time or right after the time of Clement, to about the year AD 300 to 313. We're being a little ambivalent about that date because it overlaps with some things we'll be talking about on Wednesday as well when we pick up right there. This period of time is often identified in church history as the period of the great persecutions. But it then depends on which historian or amateur historian you're following to find out how many times there were actually major persecutions. Some will list as many as 9 or even 10 periods of time in which persecution took place. Other historians will say really there were only about 3 to 5 times. And I'm not here to argue about that because there clearly is evidence that there were numerous times during these about 200 plus years while Christianity was not a legal religion in the Roman Empire that persecution would break out and a number, sometimes a significant number of believers would suffer punishment, imprisonment, torture, even execution. And that will be a part of what we'll be talking about today. But now, last time, just at the very beginning, I talked briefly about how we tend to break church history up into these eras. And we're in the early church era, and that's followed by the medieval era, and then we have the Reformation era, and then the modern era. And while we say those things, you'd think, well, if you got out a timeline, it should be very obvious where those breaks take place, but it isn't. Because the point of fact that history tends to flow on pretty smoothly. But however, in every part of history, whether it's the history of a certain nation, a certain people, or in our case, a certain movement, there are key events that take place during that are turning points. Doesn't everything pivot immediately when this event happens, but nevertheless, looking back in time, historians now say that was a turning point. I'm just going to tell you a few of those right here at the beginning and not even asking you to remember them necessarily right now, but we will touch on them as we move through our course. The first big pivot, our turning point, was the death of the apostles. Because after their death, there's suddenly no authoritative link immediately to Jesus. And while those who came after some of them would try to assume somewhat of the role of the apostles in being authoritative and that sort of thing, it was not the same as being an apostle. So the death of the apostles, and especially the last of the apostles, which would be, according to what scanty records we have, would be the apostle John in the AD 90s, was pretty traumatic for the church. Everybody, I guess, knew it had to happen eventually, but you're never quite ready for something like that. Yes, sir, Sean.
And that's because of the separation, no immediate link to Jesus. You're talking about the eyewitness account?
Yes.
Okay. I assume
and there were still a few eyewitnesses alive for a short time after that, no doubt, but they never had been considered authoritative in terms of speaking on behalf of Jesus. So there'd be the death of the apostles. The next really significant turning point, in my way of thinking at least, is when the Roman Empire turns to the point where there's actually an emperor on the throne who's a Christian, or at least professes to be a Christian, and that would be Constantine in AD 313. And what we're talking about today is what happens in between those two events, the death of the apostles and the ascension of Constantine to the throne in Rome and professing that he's a Christian. And
AD 13?
yes, AD 313. And then shortly after that, another very significant turning point, AD 325, is the Council of Nicaea. For the first time, all of the church in the Roman world at least pretty much has representatives at a single meeting to discuss something that was disturbing the whole church, or actually a series of events and things that were disturbing them. And it was called the Council of Nicaea. Nothing like this had happened up until that time. There had been some smaller meetings that had been on more the provincial or regional level that had started to take place in the 200s, but this was the first time something that affected the entire church in the Roman world.
What year was that?
AD 325.
This concile was a group of people who were overseas on some churches there, right? Or no?
Yeah, well, the representatives came from all around the Roman Empire to this one place, which was Nicaea, actually a very small town, just south of, by that time, the capital of the Roman Empire, which was in Constantinople. It had by that time been moved from Rome as its capital, the empire, to Constantinople. Hopefully that answered what you were asking. I'm not sure.
These, this was a major meeting, representatives came from
Right.
the whole region?
Yes, they came from all across North Africa, Egypt, what we would call the Near East, Asia Minor, Greece, Rome, Gaul, even Britain. People came from Britain to be at that meeting, traveling thousands of miles in primitive times. So it was quite an undertaking to pull together such a meeting as that. Now, some were better represented than others simply because of the ability of people to travel. Those who were closer were better represented than those further away. But almost every region of the church within the Roman Empire was represented at that meeting. The next significant turning point is often marked as AD 590, when the Bishop of Rome is finally accorded universal recognition as the head of the church. And his name was Pope Gregory the First, AD 590. Then shortly after that, just 20 years later in fact, another event starts unfolding. You don't really see the implications of it when it first starts happening, but in AD 610, a man in Saudi Arabia claims to have a vision, and his name was Muhammad.
Is this a turning point?
And that's very much a turning point. This would end up being marked as the beginning of the Islamic faith, another Abrahamic faith. By that we mean a faith that connects back to Abraham, Jewish faith, Christian faith, now the Islamic faith coming off from that. Yes, sir.
Can you repeat the dates of the last two things?
Okay, AD 590 for Pope Gregory, and then AD 610 when Muhammad first begins claiming to be a spokesman for God, a prophet of God. AD 1054, that's a jump forward of over 400 years. Plenty of things happened in between the previous event and that, but in AD 1054, the church has become fractured to the point in what used to be the Roman Empire, and which doesn't exist anymore by that time, that the church officially breaks into the Orthodox Church in the East and the Roman Church in the West. And AD 1054 is often called the Great Schism, or the Great Division, if you will.
Is it Orthodox in the what?
The Orthodox Church, which we would now call today the various forms of the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, all of them went one way, and then the Roman Church, or the Western Church, all of those that continued from that point forward to look to Rome and the Vatican, as we would call it today, for their leadership, formed the Western Church. Of course, this is long before Protestantism as we know it. And then again, just 50 years after that, in 1096, the First Crusade. This would be the first significant military conflict with the church leading the military against another religious group, which would be the Muslims. Yes, sir.
The Great Schism, so is that when the friction between the Protestant and the Roman Catholic?
Not yet. We're not to that. This is between the Orthodox and the Catholic, as we would call it, 1054. But in 1096, the Pope calls for a crusade to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslim infidels, basically. And of course, after that crusade, there were others, depending on how you want to count them and who they were against, as many as maybe 12 to 20 crusades, some major, a lot of minor ones, over the next 300 years. But it began there in AD 1096. But then it's not until AD 1517, again about 400 years after that last event, that a Catholic monk in Germany is so upset at the direction the church, and particularly the Pope, is going, that he actually composes a list of grievances that he feels like is completely contrary not just to the Bible, but even to church doctrine and practice, and he nails those 95 theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. And his name was Martin Luther. And he was an active monk and professor at the University of Wittenberg. But this is often seen as the catalyst for the beginning of the Protestant movement. 1517. 1611. Anybody know what happened in AD 1611? King James Version of the Bible. It wasn't the first Bible in English, but it was by far and is still by far the most successful and popular. And it put, all the pieces had come together, and so it put in the hands of ordinary people, or at least made it possible to have in the hands of ordinary people their own copy of the Scriptures in their own language, as long as their language was English.
What year was it?
1611.
Was that kind of like the Henry Ford of inventions?
Yes,
Like
in effect, yeah, there were cars before that, but it wasn't until Henry Ford that he found a way to mass produce them at an economical price and made it widely available. All those things were true of the King James Version as
so
well.
since then, the Bible, that's why the Bible is the most sold book of all time.
Yes.
Because that
Yes.
came together and everything. Okay.
Until then, that was not the case.
Yeah.
So, you said, mass production, and if your language was
English, yes.
you could have.
Not so much if you spoke French, or if you spoke German. It had already been available for quite some time. Martin Luther had actually translated it into German, and it had been available for 100 years already in Germany in German. And
German and English.
but Germany in early early 1500s, it was available in Germany, but it wasn't until 1611 it was widely available in English. There had even been English translations before then, but they were always seen as partisan. The Catholics put out their English, and one Protestant group put out their English, and another Protestant group put out their English, and everybody complained about the other ones not being accurate or whatever. So it wasn't until 1611 they found some consensus in this new translation, which actually turns out to be more of a synthesis instead of a translation of the earlier English versions, with corrections and approvals. Okay, so I just wanted to say these are the kind of things that end up being turning points. Ends up pivoting significant parts of Christian history as a result of these events. But now we're turned back to our period of time here of AD 100 to 313, and about 5 major things happen during these 200 years. And we'll try to talk to some degree about all of them today. First of all, the church will be prompted to start deciding what is going to be considered Scripture, especially the New Testament part of it, what's called the canon. Canon comes from a Latin term that actually meant a rule or a guide. And so that, in other words, that which was authoritative. And the church will start working on coming together with a canon. Now, they don't do this by putting together a committee. They don't do this by voting on it. We'll have the opportunity to briefly talk about it today, and we'll have 2 whole classes on it after the midterm break about the canon and how that came together, because I think it's very important for us to have great confidence in the scriptures that we have today. But nevertheless, the church will be devoting itself in part to that. Yes, Sean?
I'm trying to follow along in the notes as I'm typing in between, where we have the break to 100 to 313.
Yes.
That information, I'm not seeing.
Yeah, there's one more thing in that list in the printed notes from what I put up on here. So.
Okay, not a problem.
Yeah, but the very first thing in the printed version is establishing the New Testament canon.
Right.
And that's what we're talking about now. That's a significant things that happen. By the time we move into Wednesday, where we'll be talking about after 300 up till about 600, that's pretty much settled. At the Council of Nicaea, they will just put their stamp of approval on what's already happened. And Emperor Constantine had nothing to do with it. You'll sometimes find people today, they'll say, well, Constantine decided what was going to be in our Bible. He had nothing to do with it. All he did was call the Council of Nicaea into session. Beyond that, we're not even sure he could read and write. I don't know how we would know if he would have chosen these 27 books. He didn't have anything to do with that part of it. Yes, again, John.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the definition that you gave for canon, please?
The rule or guide for something.
Thank you.
And I saw a hand back over here somewhere. Yes, sir.
No, it's-
Okay. Yes, Michael.
You said, repeat what you said. What you said was, did you say Nero or another ruler?
Constantine in AD 325 called the Council of Nicaea together, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. And one of the things they discussed, it was not the number one thing on their agenda, but one of the things that was discussed and received the council's stamp of approval was whether or not these 27 books that 27 documents we have in our New Testament today, whether or not they also saw those as the Scripture.
And it would make sense what you're saying, that Constantine, he didn't have any dealings with the scriptures. He just called a session so that we could, they could gather. And
Right.
stamp
Yeah.
approval.
Yes, sir.
Can you say the same thing about when people criticize King James? Didn't he just call together the scholars to do it? It wasn't
Yes.
They say that there was a lot of influence that he pushed onto him. Is that the case at all?
Well, if you actually go read the histories of the time and those who actually participated in that process, the main influence he had was to get her done, so to speak. He didn't care what they came up with, just get it done, following the more general agreement they had already had to get something that all branches of Christianity that existed in England at that time could live with. Catholic, Anglican, Protestant, that everyone could at least live with the translation that was produced. That was his role in that. And that's sort of what Constantine did at the Council of Nicaea. I don't think he really cared what their end-up decision was, just that they all could agree on it and then bind themselves to take it back to their churches and make it the rule of faith where they were from. So, yes.
Do we have it recorded a set year that all of the books we have in the New Testament were part of the canon? Because I know some of them were included, then for a while some of them were disputed. Do we have a year that all of them are?
We've seen different things. I noticed in our timeline we have it. I believe one it gives here is in right underneath AD 200. It says that by AD 200 a list was being circulated in which 23 of the 27 were there. But it would still be another 75 to almost 100 years before a couple of the smaller books, for example, 2nd and 3rd John and Jude, that were kind of late, and probably Hebrews. Those were probably the last 4 to finally be recognized universally. Now, that doesn't mean that there were significant numbers or even a minority who thought they were not Scripture. They just, rather than being easy, they were being difficult to be convinced. They recognized that once you declare something Scripture, that becomes the rule. That's going to be normative from that point forward. So they would rather, many of them, would have rather left something out that should have been in there rather than put something in that shouldn't have been. And that's what you wanted. And that's how that was being processed. And it was happening in, in different churches all around the empire. And then as they had communication and intercourse with each other, and some of these smaller meetings they had, they would compare notes with each other. Well, what do you think about this? What do you think? Well, any evidence for this or for that? And so,
When you think of the content in Jude,
mm-hmm.
the content in First Peter, and the content in the Book of Hebrews, which we struggle now
mm-hmm.
with that content. I can imagine them back then and deciding, hey, is this in, is it out? And they finally came to conclusion.
Yeah, they did not believe any of those things were inconsistent with the rest of the New Testament that was widely accepted, and definitely not contradictory to it. But there was some things that were different.
Right.
And that is part of what the struggle was, along with not always being for sure who the author was, as in the case of Hebrews. But so that made them extra careful about that, because they couldn't clearly say this is an epistle of Paul or this is an epistle of John or something like that. But one big thing that's going to happen during this 200-year period of time, they'll finally settle on mostly the canon. And then secondly, this will be a time of persecution. The church was not legal. I try to be careful not to say illegal. There was times it was actually illegal. It just wasn't legal. In other words, it didn't have the official stamp of approval, and therefore some measure of protection granted to it by the government. And so that just made it sort of an outlier during this period of time. And at times it was illegal, in that specific emperors would declare things that Christians just, as a general rule, could not do, and that therefore made them outlaws for a period of time.
So they were laws made directly against the Christians?
Yes, at times. None of those lasted much past the term of that particular emperor. It's not like they became foundational laws of the empire that continued on from generation to generation. Yes.
And then after 313 was when laws were made to protect the church? And that's
Yes. In fact, there was actually a meeting between, at that time, until Constantine was able to consolidate his power. The empire was split east and west because to manage it more efficiently. So the two emperors got together, the Eastern Emperor, the Western Emperor, and they signed together an edict called the Edict of Milan, which is where it was done at, or the Edict of Toleration, which is what it accomplished, that declared that whether Christianity or any other religion in the empire, as long as they were not doing something else illegal or contrary to the best interest of the empire or the peace of the people, then they were allowed to practice their religion without interference by the government.
Edict of what again?
It was sort of a Bill of Rights.
Is that Milan?
The Edict of Milan, that's in Italy, is where they signed it at. But it's also called the Edict of Toleration.
Did you say 1013 or 313?
I don't know what I said. It took place in AD 311, so, and that was 2 years before Constantine was finally able to take power from the other emperor that he just signed the paper with 2 years before, and then became emperor of the entire Roman Empire again. Yes, Tim? You just looked intelligent back there, so I wanted to make sure.
Be careful.
Yeah, call you out on that.
But anyway, there's going to be these times of persecution. Many of them happen just in local areas, but some of them were empire-wide, especially toward the end of this period of time. It's so like the empire will go through these great throes of trying one last time to deal definitively with Christianity before they finally just have to give up. And so a period of great persecution. Number 3, there'll be the rise of great leaders in the church. They go under 3 categories. Martyrs, those who died for their faith, and they're not exclusive. Apologists, those men who speak and are right to defend what Christians believe. And theologians, those who are trying to flesh out in more detail exactly the Christian faith. So, for example, it seems that the Christians in the first century were simply happy to know that the Word became flesh and lived for a while among us. But by the 200s, there are men working trying to explain how. And how does that all fit together with the nature of God and the nature of man, the nature of good, the nature of evil, and all of that. And ultimately that will be probably the crowning reason for the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, is to bring some consensus among the theologians and leaders in the church everywhere about the nature of Christ. So we'll have these great men arise, and I want you to at least recognize after a while their names when you hear them, whether you remember all that much about them or not. Then it's going to be a period of heresies and controversies. Part of that is because they didn't have the canon nailed down yet. But in truth, the greater part of it is that just seems to have always been the nature of the history of the church, even in our day, long after we all know exactly what the canon is. If they already had all 27 books of the New Testament in AD 110, that probably would not have stopped any of the great heresies and controversies that happened during those 200 years. Because those who are heretics or false teachers or end up being the champions of controversies are working on the margins of things. They seldom go at the fundamentals. They work out on the margins. So it's going to be a time of heresies and controversies. It's going to be a time of changes taking place in the church that makes it look different than what the New Testament church looked like. Okay. So let's talk first of all about what's happening in the Roman Empire, because as we know, what happens in a nation influences the church in that nation. Isn't that true with us? It happens with us. We'd like to say we're apolitical, but once you say that, I want you to prove it to me, because just about every one of us have an opinion one way or the other about various things political, and that often ends up shaping the church in one way or another. Other things that shape it is laws of that country affect the church as well, and that was very much the case in the Roman Empire. Well, here's a list of those emperors during this period of time, from about AD 100 up until before Constantine, that are usually credited with launching persecutions against Christians. And I notice one more they have in our timeline I didn't put up there. Not all scholars seem to be fully agreed that Severus Septimus around AD 200 also, as an emperor, launched persecution against Christians, but I don't really find a whole lot of information about it. There is some references to it, but so that could be added as well. But I'm just putting that up there because we'll talk about persecution after we talk about what's going on in the Roman Empire. Some big things that happened around AD 79. Again, I don't expect you to remember it, but you should have heard this somewhere in your world history. In AD 79, Mount Vesuvius explodes. And two very important cities are almost immediately buried, and all the people who lived in those cities die. In Pompeii, in Herculaneum, I believe was the name of the other city. And it's only been in recent times that archaeologists have been excavating parts of Pompeii, and perhaps you've even seen some of the pictures of people frozen in place, laying on the ground, mothers holding a child, someone holding their money, whatever they were trying to get out of town with, and they were just overwhelmed by the gas and ash cloud and died there. And then as the ash continued to fall, and just fell like snow, but so thick and so quick that eventually it buried everyone, and over time as it hardened and it rained on it, it became just like rock. So people were entombed in that. That was true people who were outdoors as well as those who were in buildings. The weight of the ash on the roofs of the buildings caused many of the roofs and then ceilings to collapse, so people who had sought refuge in time are crushed or trapped in there with no way out. Thousands of people. I've heard different estimates. We don't really know how many because no one was counting beforehand, and it still hadn't been fully excavated today by the archaeologists to count on that, but some estimates go as high as maybe 70,000 people.
And you said what year did the archaeologists begin to find?
Just in recent years, I don't know which year, but it's since I've been alive, they've been excavating it. So sometime in the last 70 years. So.
1900s for you guys?
Well, maybe later than that. Again, we're right at the tip end of our New Testament period of time, but in AD 81, a new emperor comes to the throne. We had Vespasian that was from 69 to 79. He was the Roman general that was going to conquer Jerusalem, but whenever things were in a turmoil after Nero's death in Rome, he rushes back to Rome. There had been 3 or 4 other men who for very short periods of time tried to be emperor after Nero died. But when he arrives in town, he's got the support of the military, and so he's appointed the emperor. He's emperor 69 to 79. On his death, his son Titus, who finished the job back in Judea of conquering Jerusalem and destroying the rebels, he is made emperor, but he only serves for about 2.5 years, from 79 to 81, before he also dies. And there's no suspicion of foul play with that. Just he dies, and the man who comes to the throne is by the name of Domitian. Domitian is known in history for 2 things, and they're connected, but he did many others. But from a Christian history standpoint, Domitian, 81 to 96, during that period of time, he wanted greater loyalty from the subjects of the Roman Empire. So he enacted a series of laws and so forth that, first of all, declared that he was divine. And he went by the title Lord and God the Emperor. And starting with the military, all soldiers swore allegiance to Domitian as if he were a god. And they worshipped him. On their standards they carried, if you've seen in the movies where they show the Roman legions carrying their standards, there was included a symbol that represented the emperor, and they would have times of worship to the emperor. But then that spread eventually beyond just the military, where he demanded it, even though it was very unevenly applied throughout the empire, but he demanded that public officials, governors, and so forth everywhere swear their allegiance to him as well. And, of course, Christians couldn't and wouldn't do that, most of them. And so in the early 90s, persecution breaks out in some areas of the empire. Sometimes it was under the guidance of the emperor himself. More likely it was just overly zealous governors, or prefects, or generals in certain areas. One of those areas where the persecution broke out was in Asia Minor, the area that the book of Revelation is written to, where the 7 churches of Asia are. And they're enduring that persecution because of Domitian. And the last living apostle is exiled to the island of Patmos, which is an island a few miles off the coast of Ephesus. And it's there that he writes the book of Revelation, which is an apocryphal, in other words, a symbolic telling of the conflict between God's kingdom and the kingdom of Rome, I'm convinced. And that eventually God will win. No surprise. But that was Domitian. His persecution, therefore, was a little more widespread than Nero's was, because Nero's was pretty much confined just to the area in and around Rome and the Italian peninsula. When Domitian dies, the man that takes his place, don't need to talk about him. He only lives like 1 year, then dies in office. And then he is replaced at his death by Emperor Trajan or Trajan from 98 to 117. And we have a letter written by the governor called Pliny the Younger, again in Asia Minor, in which he's writing to the emperor, and the emperor is Trajan. He's writing to the emperor and said, "What do I do with these Christians? I've arrested and tortured some of them to see what their guilt was, their crime was," but he said, "All I can figure out is they gather together early on the first day of the week and sing hymns to someone named Christ as if he were a god. Then they pledge themselves to live righteous and holy lives." He said, "Beyond that, I can't find they're doing anything wrong. So I'm asking Your Excellency, what should I do with these people?" And basically the answer that we have that came back from Trajan was, don't spend all your time trying to hunt these people down. But if they start making a show of themselves or somehow get hauled into court for some other reason, then you have the right to persecute them. But even Trajan was saying, it's not an official government policy to hunt down Christians just because they're Christians. But some of that did go on because, as I say, overzealous governors who had a great deal of leeway or latitude in some of these kind of areas in their regions would be doing that. On his death, the Emperor Hadrian comes to power from 117 to 138, one of the longer ruling emperors by this period of time. And Hadrian's known for several things. One thing that classical historians know about Hadrian is he decided that the empire was big enough. No more conquest. Instead, let's fortify our borders and protect ourselves from the barbarians. And so, for example, in the northern part of Britain, he built a wall all the way across called Hadrian's Wall because of those pesky Scots who lived up in the north who kept attacking his troops. And so he built a wall to keep the Scots out. And in other places as well, in part of Germanica, he built a wall.
They lost a whole legion of soldiers to the Germans.
Yes.
That's what's up.
But, his idea was let's consolidate, let's unify, let's defend. And that's one big thing he's known for. And there were some other things as well. He was generally considered a good emperor by the definition used for Roman emperors, even though there was some persecution of Christians during his period of time. He had a male lover that he carried with him everywhere, even though he was married. And other things like that. By our Christian standards, not a very savory person. He was a brilliant administrator, but could be extremely cruel as well. And there are some records in history of how viciously and violently he dealt with some things as well. Then, skip all the emperors in between. There was this emperor in AD 161 to 180, Marcus Aurelius. He's one of our persecutors. He had the idea we need to make Rome great again. I mean, almost literally, that was his slogan.
What does that sound like?
Let's make Rome great again. Well, and how are you going to do that? You're going to return to what was considered the classic values of Rome, which was a state religion that everybody worshipped the gods of Rome. Everybody swore allegiance to the gods of Rome. Now, you could keep your other religion as long as you could swear allegiance to the gods of Rome. And let's make the gods happy, and maybe they'll bless Rome again, because they'd just gone through a great disease that swept through the entire empire, where maybe as many as a third of the entire population of the Roman Empire died just a few years before that. And that was interpreted by some as being the punishment of the gods of Rome upon them for having abandoned them. And a certain part of that was, Christians who not only wouldn't swear allegiance to the gods of Rome, but also were worshiping another god, and in fact, which some people called Christians atheists, because they didn't believe in the gods of Rome. So let's punish them. The gods are no doubt unhappy with people in the empire like this. So that'll be Marcus Aurelius. After Marcus Aurelius, and the emperor that followed him was a bad one. Any of you ever see the Russell Crowe movie, Gladiator, and that emperor in there? That emperor in that Gladiator movie is not a real emperor. I mean that in the sense that he doesn't represent specifically one emperor in the Roman Empire, but the one who he is closely modeled after is Commodus, this emperor here. And so, or Commodus, some will call him that. I don't know which is correct. But the Emperor Commodus, about 13 years as emperor, one of the worst of the emperors. Then after his death, utter turmoil in the empire. Commodus was assassinated. And then suddenly, like we'd had back in the late 60s, in 1 year we have 5 different men declared emperor. And each one dies violently, and someone takes his place.
What else did you put under Commodus other than being assassinated, right?
Yes, and he was a really terrible emperor. He did not administrate the empire well. He was focused almost entirely upon himself and thought that being emperor meant that you have the right to live as luxurious as you want and use all the resources of the state to satisfy your depraved desires, whatever they might be.
How did he treat the Christians? Yeah.
Well, during Commodus, we don't have any particular record that he persecuted them. He wasn't busy doing anything but satisfying himself. He didn't care. But we have the 5 emperors that died during that time, and then the emperor that comes to power in AD 193. I don't even remember his name, but I know from then until around AD 251, we have 17 emperors in less than 60 years, and all but one of them die violently. Most of them by assassination or murder. A couple of them died in battle, either with the guy that ended up taking their place or with some barbarians on the edges of the empire that they were fighting against. But the emperor that finally comes to power, the 17th of those, is the Emperor Decius. And he finally has consolidated his power, has a significant amount of the military behind him. And he almost immediately begins a persecution against Christians. But it wasn't so much that it was specifically against Christians, it was that he was trying to get everyone to swear allegiance to him, sort of like Domitian had done so long before. But it was the Christians who had the most trouble with that. The Jews were exempt because they had already been exempted long before for their peculiar kind of religion, and so it was understood by the Roman state not to demand that they do it, but since Christianity was still not a legal religion, those who professed Christianity, that was no excuse. You either swore allegiance to the Roman Empire, you made a sacrifice to the gods, and a Roman magistrate or an authority is there, and when you did that, a piece of paper, so to speak, was written out, a certificate, a libellus it was called, was given to you, and you were exempt for the next year or 2 years. I've heard different numbers on that, but so you only had to do this like once a year or once every 2 years, but you got a libellus. And these libelli end up being a cause of division in the church. Because some believers, out of fear for their life, will bend and go make their little offering to the gods and get their libelli. But the church says, then you've participated in idolatry and you're excommunicated.
How to spell that? Libelli?
Libelli. That's the plural of it, Libelli. A single one is called libellus, which is a Latin term. Basically just means certificate.
And that's under which emperor, sir?
That was under Decius in 250-51. A lot of Christians died during this time. This is the nearest thing to an empire-wide persecution we've had until this point, including the bishop in Rome, the bishop of Antioch, the bishop of Alexandria were among those who were martyred. By this time, the 5 leading bishops in the whole Roman Empire were Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And 3 of those 5 died. Capital punishment, because they would not make the sacrifices. But they were only the tip of that. The bishop of Carthage, which is in North Africa, right across across the Mediterranean from Italy pretty much, was a man by the name of Cyprian, and at the urging of his church members, he went into hiding. He fled out into the desert and was hidden until Decius died. And then Cyprian came back, and then many of the same church members that had urged him to flee, then criticized him for not staying and suffering. But no, not to worry.
No, not to worry.
Because the emperor that took Decius' place continued the practice. The emperor Valerian in AD 257 continues the practice, and this time Cyprian turns himself in. And I wish we had the time. We will in the second half of the course, when we have a whole period on persecution, to actually, there's recorded the words of the magistrate and the words of Cyprian himself, what his response to it was, and when he's finally condemned to be executed. Well, I don't believe it was that Cyprian was a coward, and that's why he hid the first time. His flock, his church there in Carthage, thought it would be such a great loss to the church if he was lost that way, and so he listened to their persuasive words and their begging him, and that's why he hid to start with. But the second time, it was better for him to die, and so he did. The Valerian persecution, which was just a continuation of the Decian persecution, caused the death of Cyprian, as well as the bishop of Rome that would replace the one who died under Decius. that bishop also died, along with all the deacons of the church in Rome and many others. It's kind of interesting. There were times during this 200 years in which if someone came to you and said, we want you to be our next bishop. Well, what happened to our bishop? Oh, he had his head cut off yesterday. We want you to be our next bishop. This is not what I had in mind when we're talking about leadership, because it was volunteering to die. It was always the leaders they went after first. In 284, 285, the Emperor Diocletian, when he comes to power, was considered a good administrator, and he said the empire, even though it hadn't grown since the days of Trajan, or actually Hadrian, in terms of square miles that it covered, the population had greatly expanded. A lot of Germanic and other barbarian peoples had flowed into the empire, and so it overtaxed the ability of the empire to provide for all of these people. It was high unemployment, low wages, taxes were not enough to pay for all the public services that the government was trying to provide. It just looked like a disaster in the making, and so Diocletian decides the best thing to do is to break the empire into 2 parts. And have an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, and I will become the emperor of the Eastern Empire, because by that time they had already moved the capital to Constantinople in Turkey anyway. And I'll appoint an assistant to work under me so that he will get used to how this job works. So when I die, he'll be my replacement. Then he'll pick an assistant for him. He had this great plan, a great plan that only worked for exactly 20 years. But then there was another emperor chosen for the Western Empire, and he had his assistant, who was, vice emperor under him. And that's how it was supposed to work. But it doesn't last very long. But after he does this in AD 303, one of other things he decides as an administrative decision is that Christians are a problem. He already knew that from his those who had come before him. But he, along with his co-emperor Galerius, orders an empire-wide persecution. All church clergy were to be arrested and imprisoned or executed. If they would make sacrifices to the gods, their lives would be spared, though their office would be stripped from them, and they might well remain in prison. But if they didn't make the sacrifices, then they would be executed as well as lose their position. Also, the books of the Christians. This is one of the first times the actual scriptures of the Christians were being confiscated. And it's thought that probably this persecution is the reason we don't have even more copies of the documents and scrolls of our New Testament than we have now, and we have about 25,000 of them. But many were lost at this time. And Christians who, particularly those who had copies of the Scriptures, or maybe if at that time they still were not necessarily all being put into single volumes, who had just copies maybe of the epistles of Paul or one of the Gospels, who during this time of persecution, whether they were a church leader or a church member, if they surrendered that to the authorities, they were called traitores. Traitores, from which our English word traitor comes. But literally, traitores meant those who surrender that which is in their possession. And the church will, after this, have quite a controversy about what to do with those who were traitores. They now, when peace comes again in the days, around Constantine, do we accept them back into the church if they repent and confess? Or are they permanently exiled from the church? The church disagreed over that. But this happened during the days of Diocletian and Galerius. And it's unknown how many died, but it's great enough that in later church history and even today it's often referred to as the Great Persecution. There were persecutions, but then there was the Great Persecution. Well, it turned out that the Great Persecution was the last persecution of the Roman Empire. On his deathbed, Diocletian confesses it hasn't worked. And he agrees to rescind the orders for persecution. That was around AD 309. And 2 years later, after his death, the man who had become emperor in the West, Constantine, and the emperor who was now the emperor in the East, sat down together and signed the Edict of Milan. So that's what's been happening in the Roman Empire. And of course, we left out all the juicy bits about them warring for many generations with the German peoples and other things like that, and why they actually moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople and other things. But those are sort of things that touch on Christianity. Well, let's talk about some key church leaders that we'll hear during this period of time. Some, about 6 men. Obviously, we know about dozens of them and maybe even hundreds of men. But here's about 6 men that really stand out during this 200-year period of time. The earliest of them is a man by the name of Ignatius of Antioch. And again, I'm pull up a map here and just talk a little bit about, when we're talking about Antioch, here we are. That's the same Antioch that they were called Christians first at Antioch, way back in Acts chapter 11. And again, the 5 most significant churches in the empire, or the 5 most significant bishops actually, will be those in Antioch, Jerusalem, which isn't even marked on this map, Alexandria, Constantinople or Byzantium, that it was called during part of this time, and Rome. Well, if there's one thing you notice about this, 4 of those 5 cities are in the eastern part of the empire. And only one, Rome, is in the western part. And that's why Rome is often called the Western Church because everything from, part of Greece, Italy, Gaul, which is now France, Spain, and about this much of North Africa is all under the influence of the Roman Church and the Roman bishop, whereas Alexandria mostly only influences Egypt and some interior parts of Africa. Jerusalem is still being recognized mostly simply because of its historic in the birthplace of Christianity. It really is powerless as a city. Antioch influences mostly the areas off to the east, what is now today even referred to as the Eastern Church. Whereas Byzantium or Constantinople and the church there influenced most of Greece and Asia Minor, and that at that time was the heart of the Roman Empire politically. So, yes, sir.
Because we have on the east side, we have these different hubs.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the reason for different flavors of Eastern Orthodox?
Yes, it is. It is.
Okay, so Russian.
It'll be a later time before the Russian takes place when men from I think actually Byzantium go up to what is now modern day Moscow, that region up there, to preach the gospel in the 8th century. But anyway, we're mentioning Ignatius because he is from Antioch. But during a persecution, probably that's not, as far as we can tell, wasn't empire-wide because it's around AD 110 or AD 112. This would be right about the time of Trajan and Pliny the Younger, that governor was located right up in this area here, and he was persecuting Christians in his region. And so apparently there's also a governor down here in Syria persecuting Christians here. And Ignatius is arrested, and he's being sent to Rome. Don't know exactly why. We're never told why he's being sent to Rome. It may well be for the same reason that Paul was. He might have actually been a citizen of Rome, so he had the right to demand to stand before the emperor's court to be tried on something like this. But as he's being transported to Rome, they're traveling overland. Apparently, at least semi-legend is that he writes a number of letters, and we have parts of some of those letters he wrote to various churches along the way. And in those letters, he makes several references and even some quotations from the epistles of Paul. Now that's very important because very early here, AD 110, AD 112, he's quoting from the epistles of Paul as obviously something he knows, has copies of, and is treating them as scripture. Yes, sir.
I've read a couple of different things about Ignatius' letters. There seems to be two different debates that I'm aware of. So some people, especially those of the Orthodox, consider them to be real.
Yes.
And then other people consider a number of the letters that he wrote actually to be forgeries dated around 300 AD.
Right. Some of them might well be counterfeits, written later. It just attached his name to them and so forth. But I don't think there's anyone who doubts but that we have at least one or two of his letters. It's just how many do we have that we can really count on. All right, so was that our second bell? So we'll just pick up there after the